When we examine the contest between the United States and China, we tend to compartmentalize. We analyze their military capabilities separately from their economic strategies. We discuss their technological competition as if it exists in a vacuum from their financial systems. We treat cultural differences as background noise to the real story of industrial output and GDP growth. But this fragmentation prevents us from seeing the actual architecture of competition. The rivalry between these two powers is not a collection of separate contests. It is a systems-level confrontation where manufacturing policy, capital allocation, technological development, and deeply embedded cultural assumptions form an interconnected whole. To understand why China has gained ground so rapidly across multiple domains simultaneously, and why the United States has struggled to respond coherently, we must examine how these elements reinforce each other within each system. We must understand that structure determines outcomes far more than intent, and that the psychological barriers preventing the West from seeing China clearly are not separate from the economic and technological realities. They are a part of the same system. Let us begin with the foundation that underlies everything else: the question of time horizons and how capital allocation follows from them. In the United States, capital moves according to quarterly earnings cycles. Public companies are valued on their ability to deliver predictable short-term returns. CEOs face constant pressure from activist investors and boards focused on stock price performance. Private equity operates on 5 to 7 year fund cycles. Venture capital expects exits within a decade. This is not a moral failing. It is a structural feature of a financial system built on liquid capital markets, shareholder primacy, and the assumption that efficient allocation happens when capital can move freely to its highest short-term return. The incentive structure is clear: maximize near-term profitability, minimize patient investment in long-cycle assets, and avoid projects that take 15 or 20 years to generate returns. This system produced tremendous innovation in software, services, and financial engineering. It excels at rapid iteration in low capital intensity sectors, but it systematically underinvests in heavy industry, infrastructure, and foundational research with distant payoffs. China operates under a fundamentally different capital allocation mechanism. The state controls the major banks. It directs credit towards strategic sectors regardless of short-term profitability. It can sustain losses in target industries for years, or even decades, if those industries are deemed essential to long-term national capability. This is not about socialism versus capitalism. It is about the time horizon over which returns are measured. When China identified semiconductors as a strategic vulnerability in 2014, it launched the Big Fund with over $100 billion committed to building domestic chip capabilities. Much of that capital has been inefficiently deployed. Many of the companies funded have failed or underperformed. By American standards, this would be considered wasteful. But the Chinese system absorbs these losses as the cost of building industrial capacity. It treats short-term inefficiency as an acceptable price for long-term sovereignty. American analysts often mock these inefficiencies without recognizing that the system is not optimizing for profit. It is optimizing for capability accumulation. This difference in capital patience creates compounding advantages in manufacturing ecosystems. Consider the development of electric vehicle supply chains. Building a globally competitive EV industry requires simultaneous investment in battery chemistry research, cathode and anode material production, cell manufacturing at scale, battery management systems, electric motor production, charging infrastructure, and vehicle assembly. Each of these nodes requires different time horizons and tolerates different margin profiles. In a market-driven system, capital flows to whichever node offers the best risk-adjusted returns in the near term. This creates gaps. Certain crucial but low-margin segments remain underdeveloped. In China, state-backed capital filled every node simultaneously. The result is an integrated ecosystem where battery producers, motor manufacturers, and vehicle assemblers are co-located, reducing logistics costs and iteration cycles. When a battery producer needs to test a new cell format, the vehicle manufacturer is in the same industrial park. This level of vertical integration and geographic clustering is nearly impossible to replicate. When capital allocation is fragmented across short-term profit-seeking entities, the same pattern repeats in solar panels, high-speed rail, telecommunications equipment, and increasingly in AI hardware. China identified these sectors, committed patient capital across the entire value chain, accepted years of losses, and emerged with cost and capability advantages that now dominate global markets. The West watches these industries mature and then cries foul about subsidies and unfair competition. But the Chinese approach is not unfair. It is simply different. It sacrifices short-term allocative efficiency for long-term strategic positioning. American economists call this industrial policy and treat it as an inferior economic model. But when the goal is to build national capability in a specific domain, patient-coordinated capital outperforms fragmented market signals. The United States is now attempting to respond with its own industrial policy through the CHIPS Act and Inflation Reduction Act. But these initiatives face structural headwinds that do not exist in China. American subsidies are filtered through a democratic process where every constituency demands its share. Environmental reviews delay projects for years. Labor provisions increase costs. Regional equity requirements spread investment thin rather than concentrating it. This is not incompetence. It is the transaction cost of democratic governance and decentralized decision-making. China does not face these frictions. When it decides to build semiconductor capacity, land is acquired, permits are issued, and construction begins within months. The environmental and social costs are externalized or ignored. This produces speed and scale that democracies struggle to match. Now layer onto this capital structure the question of human capital development and how it connects to cultural assumptions about meritocracy and social mobility. The United States has exceptional universities that attract talent globally, but its K-12 education system has deteriorated, particularly in STEM fields. American students increasingly avoid engineering and hard sciences in favor of finance, consulting, and law because those careers offer faster returns and higher status. Chinese students face a different incentive structure. Engineering remains a prestigious and economically rational path. The Gaokao examination system, despite its flaws, funnels the top mathematical talent into technical disciplines. Parents invest heavily in education because credentialism and academic achievement remain the primary avenue for social advancement. This creates a pipeline problem for the United States. When American companies need to hire electrical engineers or materials scientists, they increasingly recruit from Asia. When Chinese companies need the same talent, they recruit domestically from an enormous pool. This is not about intelligence. It is about where societies direct their cognitive resources. The United States directs its brightest minds toward financial optimization and regulatory arbitrage. China directs its brightest minds toward manufacturing process improvement and applied physics. This human capital asymmetry becomes visible in patent filings and standard setting, but China now files more patents annually than the United States and Europe combined. Many of these patents are incremental or low quality, but the sheer volume creates a different dynamic. Chinese companies are embedding themselves in the standards-setting organizations that define global technology protocols. They are proposing technical standards for 5G, governance, and satellite communications. When you control the standards, you shape the ecosystem. American companies historically dominated these processes because they had the technical depth and the institutional knowledge. But as Chinese participation increases and American engagement becomes more politicized and fragmented, the balance is shifting. The United States is discovering that it can no longer simply assume it will set the terms for emerging technologies. Now we must address the psychological and cultural dimension, because it explains why the American response has been so slow and so contradictory. For 200 years, the West has operated under an assumption of civilizational superiority. This was not merely arrogance. It was a reasonable inference from material reality. The Industrial Revolution gave Europe overwhelming military and economic advantages. Colonialism and imperialism followed as rational exploitation of that power differential. The West built institutions, norms, and narratives that reinforced the idea that Western political systems, Western economic models, and Western cultural values were universal and superior. When Japan rose economically in the 1980s, it triggered anxiety. But Japan was a democracy and a military ally. It could be incorporated into the Western order. When the Soviet Union competed during the Cold War, it was ideologically threatening but racially and culturally familiar. It was a European civilization with a deviant political system. China represents something fundamentally different. It is a non-Western, non-white civilization that is succeeding on its own terms without adopting Western political institutions. This creates a cognitive dissonance that Western elites struggle to process. The assumption has always been that economic development requires democratization, that prosperity and freedom are inseparable. China has delivered rapid economic growth and technological advancement under a one-party authoritarian system. This outcome should not be possible according to Western political theory. The standard response is to claim that China's system is brittle, that it will collapse under its own contradictions, that the people secretly yearn for freedom. These predictions have been made for 30 years and have consistently failed to materialize. The alternative explanation, which is psychologically difficult for the West to accept, is that political systems are not universal, that different civilizations can organize themselves differently and still achieve modernity, and that the Western model is not the only path. This realization is existentially threatening because it undermines the entire moral and intellectual architecture that justified Western dominance. If China succeeds without becoming Western, then the West's success was not due to the superiority of its values. It was due to a temporary technological advantage that is now eroding. This psychological barrier manifests in policy incoherence. The United States cannot decide whether China is a strategic partner, an economic competitor, or an existential enemy. Different agencies and constituencies push in different directions. The Pentagon views China as a military threat and advocates containment. Silicon Valley views China as a massive market and seeks engagement. Wall Street views China as an investment opportunity and resists decoupling. Hollywood needs access to Chinese audiences and self-censors accordingly. This fragmentation is a structural feature of pluralistic democracies. No single authority can impose a unified strategy. China does not have this problem. The Communist Party sets the direction and all major institutions align. This creates a coherence advantage in long-term strategic competition. When China identifies semiconductors as a priority, every relevant institution moves in coordination. State banks provide capital. Universities adjust curricula. Regulators create favorable conditions. Local governments offer incentives. In the United States, when the government identifies semiconductors as a priority, the response is fragmented. Companies lobby for subsidies while continuing to offshore production. Universities resist aligning research with national priorities because academic freedom is sacred. States compete with each other to attract investment rather than coordinating. Labor unions demand wage concessions that reduce cost competitiveness. None of these actors are wrong within their institutional logic, but the system cannot produce coordinated action. Now consider how this fragmentation interacts with the information ecosystem. The American media landscape is pluralistic and adversarial. This produces accountability and transparency, but it also produces narrative chaos. Different outlets push different interpretations of China depending on their audience and ideological orientation. Some portray China as a totalitarian nightmare on the verge of collapse. Others portray it as an unstoppable juggernaut. There is no consensus narrative. Chinese citizens, by contrast, receive a much more consistent message from their media. The West is declining, chaotic, and hypocritical. China is rising, stable, and competent. This creates a morale asymmetry. Chinese elites believe their system is winning. American elites are divided and demoralized. Confidence is not everything, but in a long-term competition, belief in your own system's viability matters. If your leadership class does not believe in the sustainability of your model, it is difficult to mobilize the societal energy needed for sustained strategic competition. This brings us to the question of manufacturing and industrial ecosystems, because this is where all the other elements converge. China is now the workshop of the world, not because of low wages. Those are rising, but because it has built the deepest and most integrated manufacturing ecosystems on the planet. When you need to produce a new consumer electronics product, you go to Shenzhen, because every component supplier, every tooling manufacturer, every assembly contractor is within a 50-kilometer radius. The iteration speed this enables is impossible to match in the United States, where supply chains are global and fragmented. If you need to change a plastic mold specification in Shenzhen, you walk down the street. In the United States, you send an email to a supplier in Vietnam and wait 2 weeks. This advantage compounds. Chinese manufacturers learn faster because they iterate faster. They move down the cost curve faster because they have scale. They attract more investment because they deliver results. The ecosystem becomes self-reinforcing. The United States offshored this capability over 30 years in pursuit of short-term cost optimization. American companies could boost margins by moving production to China. Shareholders rewarded this decision. Executives were promoted. But the country lost the industrial commons, the shared ecosystem of skills, suppliers, and knowledge that makes advanced manufacturing possible. You cannot simply rebuild this with subsidies. It requires decades of patient investment in workforce training, supplier development, and infrastructure. China made this investment. The United States chose financialization instead. American companies became extremely efficient at extracting value from existing assets through stock buybacks and financial engineering. But they stopped building new productive capacity domestically. The result is a bifurcated economy. The United States has world-leading tech platforms and financial services, but it struggles to manufacture the physical goods those platforms depend on. When the pandemic disrupted supply chains, Americans discovered they could not produce masks or ventilators at scale because the industrial base had withered. China, meanwhile, has been moving up the value chain in manufacturing, while retaining capacity at every level. It still produces low-end goods, but has added high-end capabilities in aerospace, robotics, and precision equipment. This vertical integration creates resilience. When export markets slow, China can shift production toward domestic consumption. When global supply chains fracture, China can substitute domestic suppliers. The United States has lost its flexibility. It depends on global supply chains. It no longer controls. This is a strategic vulnerability that will take decades to address, if it can be addressed at all, given the structural barriers we have discussed. Now let us turn to artificial intelligence, because this is the frontier where all these systemic differences are becoming most visible. The development of AI requires three things: algorithms, computing power, and data. The United States has traditionally led in algorithms through its university research labs and corporate R&D. But algorithms are increasingly commodified. Research papers are published openly. Techniques diffuse rapidly. The real advantages now lie in computing power and data. Computing power requires advanced semiconductors and energy infrastructure. China is behind in cutting-edge chip design but has access to older generation nodes sufficient for training most AI models. It has massive energy capacity and is willing to allocate it to AI development. The United States has a more advanced chip industry but faces energy constraints and public resistance to building the massive data centers required for frontier AI. On data, China has a structural advantage. Its government can mandate data sharing across companies and sectors in ways that would be illegal in the United States. Its surveillance infrastructure generates vast streams of labeled data ideal for training computer vision and behavior prediction models. Its population is large and digitally connected, creating training datasets at scale. But more important than these technical factors is the application focus. Chinese AI development is oriented toward deployment in manufacturing, logistics, urban management, and infrastructure optimization. These are domains where AI can generate enormous productivity gains but require patient capital and coordination across many actors. American AI development is oriented toward consumer applications, advertising optimization, and content generation. These are domains with faster monetization paths but less strategic depth. Chinese AI labs are working on robotic process control for factories. American AI labs are working on generative models for marketing content. Both are valuable, but one builds long-term industrial capability and the other optimizes short-term engagement metrics. Over a 20-year horizon, the cumulative advantage will likely favor the approach that embeds AI into physical production systems rather than digital engagement systems. The West watches these developments with growing alarm but struggles to formulate a response that does not undermine its own stated principles. The United States believes in open markets, free capital flows, and academic freedom. It cannot simply copy the Chinese model without abandoning these commitments. But those commitments create vulnerabilities in strategic competition. Open markets mean Chinese companies can access American technology and capital. Free capital flows mean American investment funds. Chinese development, academic freedom means Chinese researchers train in American universities and take knowledge back home. Every attempt to restrict these flows provokes accusations of racism, protectionism, or authoritarianism. The United States is caught between its universal liberal principles and the realities of great power. Competition with a civilization that does not share those principles. China has no such dilemma. It has always been particularist. It does not claim its system is universal or exportable. It restricts foreign access to its markets, limits capital outflows, and controls information flows without apology. This asymmetry creates a competitive imbalance. One side plays by rules it has imposed on itself. The other side plays to win. The tragedy is that this conflict was not inevitable. If the West had accepted China's rise as a return to historical normalcy rather than a civilizational threat, accommodation was possible. China does not seek to convert the world to its political system. It seeks recognition, respect, and a seat at the table as a co-equal power. But this is precisely what the West cannot grant psychologically. The entire Western self-conception is built on the idea that liberal democracy is the end of history, the final form of political organization. To acknowledge that another system can succeed is to acknowledge that history has not ended, and that the West's moment of dominance was temporary. So instead of accommodation, we see escalation, technology export controls, investment restrictions, alliance hardening, and military posturing. Each side is now optimizing for competition rather than cooperation. The danger is that this logic becomes self-fulfilling. If both sides prepare for conflict, conflict becomes more likely. The economic interdependence that once created incentives for peace is being deliberately unwound. Supply chains are being duplicated at enormous cost. Technology ecosystems are fragmenting. The world is bifurcating into spheres of influence. We are watching the architecture of globalization dismantle in real time. And yet, underneath this geopolitical theater, a deeper fusion is occurring. Chinese society has absorbed more from the West than any civilization in history. It has adopted market economics, scientific methodology, technological systems, and urban modernity wholesale. The Chinese elites speak English, send their children to Western universities, and consume Western culture. The tragedy is that the West cannot see this as a complement or convergence. It sees it as appropriation or threat. The psychological barrier we began with, the inability to accept the rise of a non-Western power as legitimate, prevents the West from recognizing that China's success is actually the triumph of universal human aspirations for prosperity and dignity, achieved through a fusion of Chinese civilization and Western modernity. The question now is whether we are locked into a trajectory of confrontation or whether wisdom can still prevail. The systems-level advantages China has built in manufacturing, capital allocation, human capital development, and technological application are real and durable. They will not evaporate because the West wishes them away. The United States retains formidable strengths in innovation, military power, alliance networks, and institutional depth. But those strengths are eroding relative to China's trajectory. The gap is closing across multiple domains simultaneously. This is not a temporary phenomenon. It is the result of compounding structural advantages that will persist for decades. The West can respond in one of two ways. It can attempt to outcompete China by reforming its own systems, extending time horizons in capital allocation, rebuilding industrial ecosystems, directing talent towards strategic sectors, and coordinating policy across fragmented institutions. This path is possible, but requires painful changes in political courage. Or it can attempt to contain China through sanctions, alliances, and military deterrence, while hoping that internal contradictions cause the Chinese system to collapse. This path is more politically palatable, but carries the risk of miscalculation and conflict. What the West cannot do is continue pretending that the old order will reassert itself through inertia, that China's rise is temporary or illegitimate, or that the rules-based international system will constrain Chinese ambitions while the West declines to enforce those rules on itself. The barrier is not just in policy, it is in perception. Until the West can see China as a civilizational peer rather than an aberration, until it can accept that modernity has many paths, and until it can overcome the subconscious fear of the rising other, its strategic responses will remain reactive, contradictory, and inadequate. This systems-level competition we have examined in manufacturing, finance, technology, and human capital is downstream of this deeper psychological struggle. Structure determines outcomes, but culture shapes structure. The West built systems optimized for a world where it was permanently dominant. Those systems are poorly adapted to a world of genuine multipolarity. China built systems optimized for patient capability accumulation under conditions of permanent strategic competition. Those systems are proving more resilient in the current environment. This is not a moral judgment. It is a structural observation. The world is entering an era where two very different systems will coexist and compete for influence. The outcome is not predetermined, but the trajectory is clear. The fusion of civilizations will continue beneath the surface, even as the conflict of systems intensifies above it. How we navigate this duality will determine whether the 21st century is remembered for catastrophic conflict or unprecedented cooperation. The choice, as always, is ours to make.